This story is titled, She Walked Out on Me During Cancer Treatment, Ran Back to Her Ex, Got Betrayed Again, and Now She's Knocking on My Door. Hey everyone, before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video, hey guys. So, I've been debating whether to post this for a while. I'm not exactly the type to air my personal stuff online, but honestly, this feels like a safe space to just let it out. My name's Ethan, and last year, my life got completely turned upside down when I was diagnosed with cancer. It still feels surreal to even say that. To give you some context, I'm 32 male, and my life up to that point was pretty straightforward. I grew up in a small town in Ohio. My family wasn't exactly Hallmark material. My dad bailed when I was 6, and my mom passed away when I was in college. She had a stroke, and it was fast. One day she was here, and then she wasn't. That kind of thing changes you, you know? You learn not to rely on anyone too much because people can disappear just like that. So, yeah, I've always been kind of a loner. I don't have siblings or cousins I talk to, and most of my friendships are surface level. Not because I'm antisocial or anything, but because life just kind of drifts people apart. My family ended up being the people I chose to let into my life, and for the past 3 years, that person was Emily. Emily and I met at a friend's BBQ. She was the kind of person who could light up a room. I remember she was wearing this bright yellow sundress, and she laughed at all my dumb jokes. We clicked right away, and by the end of the night, we were already planning our first date. Things moved fast, but it never felt rushed. She was everything I thought I needed. Funny, smart, and always up for an adventure. We spent weekends exploring random small towns, hunting for the best tacos, or just vegging out on the couch with bad reality TV. She was the type of person who made you feel like the luckiest man just by being with her. When I got my diagnosis, she was the first person I told. It was late at night, and we were sitting on the couch watching something. I couldn't focus because I'd just gotten the call from my doctor earlier that day. My chest felt like it was going to cave in, and I remember blurting out, "I have cancer." Emily didn't freak out. She didn't cry or try to comfort me with meaningless words. She just grabbed my hand and said, "We'll get through this." That was the moment I realized how much I loved her. The first few weeks after the diagnosis were a blur. There were so many appointments, scans, blood work, consultations, and it all felt like this never-ending maze with no clear exit. But Emily was there for all of it. She asked the questions I was too overwhelmed to think of, took notes during meetings with doctors, and even Googled treatments late into the night. When chemo started, that's when things got really tough. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, chemo sucks. It's like your body decides to declare war on itself. I was nauseous 24/7, I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and every time I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Emily became my rock during that time. She made sure I ate, even if it was just a couple of bites of toast. She figured out how to make these smoothies that were loaded with nutrients, but didn't taste like straight-up garbage. One night, I remember lying in bed after a particularly rough treatment. My whole body hurt, and I felt like I was going to throw up every 5 seconds. Emily climbed into bed with me, wrapped her arms around me, and started telling me some ridiculous stories that happened to her in the past. I laughed so hard I almost forgot how miserable I felt. She had this way of making the world feel less heavy, even if it was just for a few minutes. There was another time I was too weak to get out of bed, and she spent the whole day bringing me water and fluffing my pillows. It wasn't just the big gestures either. She'd leave sticky notes on the fridge with little jokes or motivational quotes. She bought me these stupidly expensive headphones so I could listen to music during chemo sessions. She even made a playlist called Ethan's Feel Good Jams, which was mostly 80s pop because she knew I was obsessed with it. I kept thinking, how did I get so lucky? My friends were blown away by how supportive she was. Jake, my best friend from college, even joked, "If you don't put a ring on it after all this, you're an idiot." And honestly, he wasn't wrong. I started daydreaming about proposing once I got through this. I thought about doing it somewhere special. Maybe at one of those little towns we loved visiting, with a cheesy sign that said, "Marry me." It wasn't just about surviving cancer anymore. It was about surviving it with her. She gave me hope that there was something to look forward to on the other side. But looking back now, maybe I was holding on to an idea of Emily that wasn't entirely real. Maybe I wanted her to be my everything, because the thought of facing this alone was too much to handle. At the time, though, she seemed like the perfect partner. She made me believe I could get through anything. And for a while, I really thought we were invincible. Then, out of nowhere, things started to shift. As much as Emily showed up in the beginning, things didn't stay that way. But I didn't see it coming. Not at all. At first, things were manageable, or at least as manageable as cancer and chemo can be. The treatments were rough, no doubt about it, but I had moments where I felt okay. But as time went on, things started to change, and not just with Emily. My body was wearing down faster than I'd expected. Chemo isn't just exhausting, it's like your body rebels against you in every way possible. I couldn't eat without feeling like I'd swallowed shards of glass. Even drinking water felt like a challenge some days. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, too tired to even sit up in bed. My hair started falling out in clumps, and my skin looked pale and thin, like paper. The worst part was the weakness. Before this, I was a relatively healthy guy. I worked out, ate decently, and could handle a full day of work without crashing. But now, just walking to the kitchen felt like climbing a mountain. I couldn't shower without sitting down halfway through, because standing up for more than a few minutes left me dizzy and lightheaded. At first, Emily seemed like she was all in, but then her actions started to change. Considering my condition, I needed her support more than ever, but she stopped checking in as much, and her responses to my texts got slower and more distant. I told myself she was probably just busy. She had her own life after all, but then it became harder to ignore. She started skipping important things, like appointments we'd planned together. It wasn't just an occasional slip, it became a pattern, and it left me feeling more alone than ever. She'd tell me she was running late, or that something came up at the last minute. One time, I waited at the hospital for over an hour before I realized she wasn't coming. When I called her, she apologized and said she'd lost track of time. I told myself it was fine, that she was just stressed or overwhelmed, but the excuses kept coming. She needed a break. She had errands to run. She didn't feel well. It felt like every day she was pulling away a little more. One night, I had an especially bad reaction to chemo. My body was shaking uncontrollably, and I couldn't keep anything down. I called Emily, desperate for some kind of reassurance, but she didn't pick up. When she finally called me back hours later, she sounded irritated. "Ethan, I'm out with the girls. Can't this wait?" I didn't even know how to respond. I just mumbled something about not feeling well and hung up. I sat there in the dark, clutching my phone, wondering if I was being unreasonable. Maybe she deserved a break. Maybe I was asking too much. But as time went on, it became harder to ignore the signs. Emily wasn't just tired. She was checked out. She stopped asking how I was feeling, or what the doctors had said. She'd show up late, leave early, or skip visits altogether. And when she was around, she wasn't really present. The next few weeks were a blur of appointments, treatments, and sleepless nights. My condition kept declining, and Emily kept drifting further away. She stopped staying over as much, saying she needed space to clear her head. I overheard her on the phone one day, venting to a friend about how hard it was to watch me go through this. "It's just so much," she said. "I didn't sign up for this." Those words hit me harder than any chemo session ever could. I wanted to confront her, to ask her if she really felt that way, but I didn't. Maybe I was scared of the answer, or maybe I just didn't want to admit what I already knew. Emily was done. I started noticing other things too, small but telling. She'd leave dishes in the sink when she stayed over, something she never used to do. She'd roll her eyes when I asked for help with simple things, like getting a glass of water. She stopped touching me, even small gestures like holding my hand or brushing her fingers through my hair. Once I overheard her muttering under her breath after I asked her to grab my medication from the bathroom. "You're not helpless," she'd said, just loud enough for me to hear. I don't know when exactly it happened, but at some point, I stopped asking for her help altogether. It was easier to struggle on my own than to feel like a burden. The worst part was, I still loved her. I still wanted to believe she was the person who'd held my hand in the beginning, who'd promised we'd get through this together. But every day, it felt like she was becoming a stranger. The final straw, when my love for her started to vanish, came one evening after a brutal day. I'd been feeling weaker than usual, like my body was barely holding itself together. But I thought I could make it to the kitchen for some water. Emily was standing nearby, scrolling through her phone like she always did these days. I managed a few shaky steps before the dizziness hit me, and I collapsed to the floor. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a few seconds I couldn't even think straight. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Emily glance up. For a moment, I thought she was about to rush over and help. She was just standing there, her phone still in her hand. But instead of moving toward me, she sighed and said, "Ethan, I told you not to push yourself." Her voice wasn't panicked or concerned. It was flat, detached, like she was commenting on a minor inconvenience. I expected her to put the phone down and come over, but she didn't. She just went back to scrolling, occasionally glancing my way like I was a pile of laundry she couldn't be bothered to deal with. I lay there on the floor, too stunned to say anything. My body was screaming in pain, my head spinning, but all I could focus on was the fact that she wasn't moving. She didn't even kneel down to check on me. Eventually, exhaustion won. I passed out right there on the floor. When I woke up, I found myself still lying in the same spot where I'd fallen. Emily hadn't moved me. She hadn't called for help. She hadn't done anything. She was gone. The lights in the living room were still on, but there was no sign of her. A blanket had been tossed onto the couch, like she'd decided to sleep there instead of dealing with me. I lay there for a while, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How had we gone from "we'll get through this" to this? That moment was when it hit me. Emily wasn't just pulling away. She didn't care anymore, if she ever had. She wasn't my partner anymore. She was just someone who happened to be there. And even that was becoming less and less frequent. I didn't know it at the time, but I was already starting to prepare myself for the possibility that I'd have to face this battle alone. I just didn't realize how soon that moment would come. After that particular night, something inside me shifted. I stopped expecting Emily to step up. I stopped expecting anything from her. She was still around, physically, but it was like living with a ghost. We barely talked, and when we did, it was short and transactional. "Do you need anything from the store? Your pills are on the counter." It felt like she was counting down the days for me to die and she could leave without looking like the bad guy. At that point, my focus wasn't on her anymore. It couldn't be. I was too busy trying to keep myself alive, both physically and mentally. The treatments were brutal, and my body wasn't bouncing back the way I'd hoped. Every day was a grind, and the loneliness I felt, even with Emily still technically there, was suffocating. During one of my longer chemo sessions, a nurse came over to adjust my IV. She noticed I was struggling to reach my water bottle and handed it to me without missing a beat. "You'd think they'd design these chairs with actual humans in mind?" she joked, flashing a quick smile. I couldn't help but laugh, something I hadn't done in days. Curious, I asked her name. "Sophia," she said, still smiling as she adjusted the drip. It wasn't a big moment, but it stuck with me, her kindness cutting through the heaviness like a breath of fresh air. It wasn't a groundbreaking moment or anything, just a simple comment, but it caught me off guard. I hadn't laughed in weeks. She smiled when I chuckled, a quick, easy smile that felt like the first bit of sunlight I'd seen in months. After that, I started seeing her more often during my visits. She wasn't always my nurse for the day, but she'd swing by to check on me anyway. She'd ask how I was holding up, whether the meds were helping, and what I was doing to pass the time. She never seemed rushed or impatient, even though I knew how hectic her job must have been. One day, after another particularly draining treatment, she sat down next to my chair during her break. "You look like you could use a distraction," she said, pulling out her phone. "Want to help me pick a new dog name for my parents' dog?" We spent the next 10 minutes debating dog names like it was the most important thing in the world. By the end of it, I'd forgotten how miserable I felt, if only for a little while. Sophia was like that. She had this way of making the world feel lighter, even when everything around me felt impossibly heavy. It was the way she listened. She never treated me like a patient or a checklist. When I talked about how much I missed being able to do simple things like cooking my own meals or going for a walk, she didn't brush it off with empty platitudes. She just listened, nodded, and said, "That sucks, Ethan. I'm sorry." I don't think I realized how much I needed that. Someone to acknowledge that what I was going through did suck, without trying to sugarcoat it or make it about them. The more I got to know her, the more I looked forward to my treatments. Not because I enjoyed sitting in a chair for hours while chemicals were pumped into my body, but because I knew there was a good chance Sophia would be around. At home with Emily, though, we're unraveling fast. I stopped expecting her to show up for me in any meaningful way. She'd made it clear where she stood, on the sidelines, watching but not participating. I still remember when during one of the sessions, as Sophia adjusted my IV, she said something that stuck with me. "You know, it's interesting," she said, her tone light but her words oddly heavy. "How much clarity people find toward the end. It's like they start to see what really matters." She gave me a small, almost sympathetic smile before turning back to her clipboard. "Let me know if you need anything else," she added, walking off like she hadn't just dropped a weight on my chest. It was casual, too casual, but it left me wondering if she knew something I didn't. The breaking point came on a random Tuesday night. I'd just finished a round of chemo earlier that day and went home. I was wiped out. My body felt like it was made of lead, and the nausea was hitting me hard. Emily came home after work, tossed her purse on the counter, and said, "I'm going out with Kristen tonight. Don't wait up." I didn't say anything at first. I didn't have the energy to argue, and frankly, I wasn't even surprised. But as she grabbed her coat and headed for the door, something in me snapped. "Emily," I called on her. "Can we talk for a minute?" She turned around looking annoyed. "What is it, Ethan?" "I'm going to be late." I stared at her, trying to find the right words. "Do you even want to be here anymore?" Her face shifted. "What kind of question is that?" "It's an honest one," I said. "Because it doesn't feel like you do. You're barely here, and when you are, it's like you can't wait to leave." Her expression hardened. "I'm trying, Ethan. But do you have any idea how hard this is for me? Watching you go through this? It's exhausting." There it was again. That word. Exhausting. Like I was some impossible task she couldn't check off her to-do list. "I didn't choose this," I said, my voice cracking. "I didn't ask for cancer, Emily. But I thought—" I stopped myself, realizing I was about to say something that would only hurt me more. She sighed, her frustration clear. "Look, I can't do this right now. I'll see you later." And with that, she walked out the door. When she came home later that night, I was already asleep, or at least pretending to be. The next morning, she sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Ethan, we need to talk." I knew what was coming before she even said it. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I've been trying, but I'm not strong enough to see you go through this. I need space." I didn't argue, I didn't beg, I just nodded and said, "Okay." She looked surprised, like she'd expected me to fight her on it. But what was the point? She'd already made her decision. By the end of the week, she was gone. She packed her things and left, leaving behind an empty apartment and an even emptier feeling in my chest. For a while, I just went through the motions. I focused on my treatments, trying not to dwell on what had happened. But the thing about cancer is, it doesn't give you much room to grieve. You don't have time to sit around feeling sorry for yourself when every day is a fight to stay alive. Sophia, though, became a lifeline during that time. She didn't know the details of what had happened with Emily, but she could tell I was struggling. She started checking in more often, asking how I was holding up and making sure I was eating. One day, after a particularly rough session, she sat down next to me during her break. "You know," she said, "you're allowed to be mad about everything. You don't have to pretend you're okay all the time." I looked at her, surprised. "How do you know I'm pretending?" She smiled gently. "Because I see it all the time. People think they have to put on a brave face, even when they're falling apart. But it's okay to fall apart, Ethan. It doesn't make you weak." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For so long I'd been trying to keep it together, to push through without showing how much it hurt, physically and emotionally. But hearing someone tell me it was okay to feel everything, to let myself be human, was like a weight being lifted off my shoulders. Sophia didn't just make me feel cared for, she made me feel seen. Over the next few weeks, our conversations started to shift. They weren't just about my treatments anymore. We talked about everything. It felt easy, natural, like I didn't have to try so hard to keep up appearances. Little by little, Sophia became the person I looked forward to seeing the most. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a friend. But still, Emily's sudden change and absence didn't make sense to me. I kept wondering about how she just turned her back on me and left. Not long after Emily left, I heard from mutual friends that she had gone back to her ex, Aaron, the guy who had shattered her heart repeatedly before I even came into the picture. I only knew him through the stories Emily shared when we first started dating. She called him the biggest mistake of her life, a serial cheater and liar who always managed to worm his way back into her life when it suited him. Finding out she ran back to him hit differently than I expected. It didn't hurt like heartbreak, and it definitely didn't spark jealousy. It was pure disbelief. After everything, she chose to leave me during my hardest battle just to return to someone she had sworn she was done with. The logic, or lack of it, was mind-boggling. I couldn't help but smirk at the irony of it all. Emily had spent years tearing Aaron apart with stories of his toxicity, swearing she'd never let herself fall into his trap again. Yet, here she was, running straight back into the chaos she claimed to hate. Her actions spoke volumes, far louder than any of her words ever had. The news didn't change much for me, though. By that point, I'd already accepted that Emily was out of my life for good. As time went on, something shifted in me. I realized I was stronger than I thought. When I finished my last round of treatment and heard the word remission, I cried. Not just because I'd survived cancer, but because I'd survived losing Emily too. That moment felt like the end of one chapter and the start of another. I wasn't the same person I was when all of this began. Cancer and everything that came with it had changed me, and honestly, I was grateful for it in a strange way. I wasn't just tougher, I was more grounded. My perspective on life had shifted. Little things I used to stress about, work deadlines, social obligations, keeping up appearances, didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the people who stood by me, the progress I was making, and the future I was finally beginning to believe I could have. I felt lighter, like I could finally put down the emotional weight I'd been carrying for so long. Emily's absence no longer felt like a hole in my life. Instead, it felt like space that had been cleared for something better. Someone better. Someone like Sophia, who had stepped into my life when I needed support the most, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. As I worked to rebuild my strength, mentally and physically, I started setting new goals for myself. I wanted to travel again, to reconnect with old friends, to get back into hobbies I'd abandoned during my treatment. For the first time in a long time, I felt like my life was mine again. But, as life loves to remind you, moving forward doesn't always come without a complication. A few weeks ago, I heard through the grapevine that Emily's ex, Aaron, had dumped her. The news came from a mutual friend who dropped it casually, like it was just another piece of gossip. Yeah, I heard Aaron and Emily broke up. Apparently, he cheated on her again. Shocking, right? I tried to act indifferent, shrugging it off with a polite, huh, that's too bad. But it lingered in my mind longer than I wanted it to. Not because I cared about her relationship, but because I knew Emily. I knew how she operated. It didn't take long for my suspicions to be confirmed. A few days later, I got a text from Emily. It was short and vague. Hey, I've been thinking about you. Can we talk? I stared at my phone, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to leave the past in the past, but another part of me wanted to know what she could possibly have to say after all this time. Against my better judgment, I replied. What's up? She asked to meet in person, and I agreed, more out of curiosity than anything else. If nothing else, I figured I'd get the apology I deserved. When I walked into the coffee shop, Emily was already there, looking as polished as ever. But her eyes gave her away. Nervous, maybe even guilty. The small talk was unbearable. My health, work, nothing of substance, until she finally took a deep breath and said, Ethan, I owe you an apology. I leaned back, arms crossed. For what? For leaving you, for not being there when you needed me. For everything, she stammered, her voice cracking. I panicked. I didn't know how to handle it, and I made the worst mistake of my life. I nodded slowly. And then you ran back to Erin. Her face flushed, and she stared down at her coffee. That was a mistake too. I thought things might be different, but he hasn't changed. He never will. I couldn't help but laugh, bitter and sharp. Wow, shocking revelation. Ethan, I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realize now what I lost when I left you. I never stopped loving you, but I panicked. I weighed my options, and I thought Erin was the safer choice. But I was wrong. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I want to try again, if you'll let me. I stared at her for a long moment. Then leaning forward, I said, Emily, you didn't just leave. You walked out when I needed you the most. Now that Erin's gone, you come back? That's not love. That's convenience. She opened her mouth to argue, but I raised a hand, stopping her. Love is about showing up, and you didn't. When things got hard, you disappeared, I said, my voice steady and cold. I'm not that guy anymore, Emily. I'm done with cancer, and I'm done with you. I fought too hard to survive both to let you back into my life. Her tears fell, but I didn't flinch. I wasn't angry, and I wasn't sad. I was done. Standing up, I grabbed my coat. Take care. I walked out, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders, thinking that was the end of it. I walked out of that coffee shop feeling lighter, like I'd closed a door that had been left open for far too long. For the first time, I truly believed I was free of Emily and all the baggage that came with her. But of course, Emily wasn't about to let things go so easily. A few weeks after that conversation, Emily kept trying to call me and reach out, but I blocked her everywhere. I was settling into my new routine, working on my health, spending more time with Sophia, and finally starting to feel like I had a grip on my life again. Then, one afternoon, I got a text from a former coworker. Hey, heads up. Emily applied for a job here. Did you know about this? My stomach sank. The idea of Emily working at the same company as me wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unthinkable. I hadn't even told her I'd started working there after my recovery, so it couldn't have been a coincidence. What really threw me, though, was when I found out she'd listed me as a reference on her application. I couldn't believe the nerve. After everything, she actually thought I'd vouch for her? I emailed HR immediately, making it clear that I wouldn't be providing a reference for Emily and that I was uncomfortable with the situation. I kept it professional, but I didn't hold back. This wasn't just about protecting myself. It was about setting boundaries that I should have set a long time ago. HR assured me they'd handle it discreetly, and for a moment, I thought that would be the end of it. But like always, Emily found a way to escalate things. A week later, I walked into the break room during lunch and froze. There she was, standing by the coffee machine, chatting with one of my team leads like she belonged there. She saw me before I could slip out, and her face lit up with a smile that made my blood boil. "Ethan, what a coincidence," she said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. I forced a polite nod and grabbed a cup of water, hoping she'd take the hint and leave me alone. She didn't. "Did you know I applied here?" she asked, following me to the counter. "I thought it would be a great opportunity, and now it's even better knowing we'd be working together." I turned to her, my expression blank. "Emily, this isn't the place for this conversation." Her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, turning back to the others in the room. "Ethan and I go way back," she said, laughing like we were old friends. "It'll be so nice to catch up while working together." I left without another word, my frustration barely contained. I went straight to my manager and explained the situation in more detail. I didn't go into everything. There was no need to rehash all the drama, but I made it clear that I needed this situation to be handled. My manager was understanding and assured me that Emily's application wouldn't move forward. HR followed up the next day, confirming that she hadn't been selected for the role. I thought that would be enough to put an end to her antics, but I underestimated just how far Emily was willing to go. The very next day, she showed up at the office again. Not for an interview, just lingering in the hallway near my desk acting like she belonged there. As I walked to a meeting, she stepped in front of me. "Ethan, wait, we need to talk," she said, desperation in her voice. I stopped, keeping my tone cold. "Emily, this is my workplace. You have no business being here." "I just want to make things right," she insisted, her voice rising. "Why won't you give me a chance to explain?" I stared her down. "You had plenty of chances. I've already moved on, Emily. My heart is with someone who stayed when things got hard. There's no room for you anymore." Her face twisted with anger and she snapped, "You've moved on? Who is she? After everything we had?" "Emily, lower your voice," I said, my patience thinning. Instead, she lost it and started yelling louder, accusing me of betraying her. People were staring, and before I could respond, security arrived. They asked her to leave, but she kept shouting, insisting I owed her another chance. I walked away, heading straight to HR to file a formal report. By the time I finished, security confirmed she'd been escorted out and banned from the building. I couldn't believe how far she could reach. Sophia noticed I seemed off that day, and when I told her about what happened, she just shook her head. "That's not your problem anymore, Ethan," she said, her voice calm but firm. "She's trying to pull you back into her mess. Don't let her." Sophia was right. Emily's drama wasn't my responsibility. I'd fought too hard to get to where I was, to rebuild my health, my happiness, and my life. Emily had no place in any of it, and I wasn't going to let her derail the progress I'd made. A week later, HR confirmed that Emily wouldn't be allowed to apply for any future roles at the company. Knowing that was the final nail in the coffin of her attempts to insert herself into my life felt like closure. The person I used to be, the one who might have entertained her excuses, who might have been tempted to give her one more chance, was gone. I'd grown past her, and I wasn't looking back. Instead, I focused on what mattered: my health, my happiness, and Sophia, who had shown me what it meant to show up for someone when it mattered most. Thank you guys for sticking with me through all of this. If my experience resonates with anyone out there dealing with toxic relationships or tough times, I hope you know that you deserve better too. Here's to growth, healing, and leaving the past where it belongs. Thanks for reading.